welcome to Scale Car Garage. Well, we're going to start on our Cobra Ferrari project, and the first step is to disassemble the Cobra Daytona Coupe made by Monogram. So why don't we get started straight away here on Scale Car Garage. Okay, as you can see, we've got the car on the block here. We of course have our Ferrari 250 GTO here with its parts. But the first thing we have to do is we have to disassemble our Monogram Cobra Daytona Coupe. Just in looking at it, I noticed that there's a little more battle damage than I thought. There's a bit of a cracked fender here, but we can fix that, no problem. But more importantly, the body and chassis are held together by 4 self-tapping screws. So we're going to take the self-tapping screws off, and we're going to disassemble the car and use as many of the components of the car as we can, and we're going to keep those components in the jewel case that the car came in so we can keep all the parts together. So why don't we start doing that right away? Here we go. So let's just screw the back here. 2 self-tapping screws. There's 1. There's 2. Let's see if we have the second one here. And you'll see that the back panel of the car comes off. You see that? There we go. And that's okay. Let's just put that in there. Turn it around. So the back valance, I guess, is the correct term. My apologies. Go over here. This front valance comes off as well, and you'll notice that, oh, there we go. There's the chassis, and there's the body. Now, so that we don't lose any of the screws here, what I would really recommend is, let's put the chassis aside for just a second, get the rear valance, and we're not going to do anything to the body yet. Let's see if that holds together here. There we go. And let's put the screws back just so we don't lose them, and also so we'll know where they go. There we go. Well, that's nice to know. How about that? All right, and then the front screws here. So now let's put the body in the jewel case for safekeeping now, and start disassembling this chassis. Well, it looks like we've got bits we can use. Of course, we can use the motor. We can use that drive shaft, believe it or not. Of course, the spur gear. Not too crazy about the crown gear. We'll count the teeth. And I think that's about it. And of course, we'll use the chassis to measure the wheelbase for the car. All right. Well, let's get to it.
The first step is to remove the front axle, followed by the guide blade and rear axle. Now, to carefully remove the drive shaft and motor from the chassis. Using the bare chassis, I was able to set the correct wheelbase of the Cobra Daytona Coupe using the Rusket Adjusto Jig. Once the wheelbase was set up, I determined the length of brass required for the chassis rails using a vernier caliper. Using a razor saw, I cut the correct length of square brass tubing. For the second rail, I found that folding the first cut on itself helps to ensure that the 2 chassis rails will be of equal length. I disassembled an old motor for the can, which will be used as a drive shaft holder and bearing. I prepped the brass, the motor, and the drive shaft can for soldering. Using the motor from the Cobra and its drive shaft, I removed the spur gear from the drive shaft and then passed it through the empty can's bearing to then determine the motor and drive shaft carrier placement in the chassis. Once this was done, it was time to solder. Then, the axle carriers were soldered to the chassis using the Rusket Adjusto Jig. Allowing the Cobra's chassis to cool, I determined the wheelbase for the Ferrari 250 GTO. I then, as I did for the Cobra, cut 2 chassis rails for the Ferrari and disassembled an old motor which will be used as a drive shaft holder and bearing. The proper placement of the motor and can were determined. Then, all the parts were prepped and soldered for the Ferrari chassis. The axle carriers were then soldered to the Ferrari chassis as they were for the Cobra chassis using the Adjusto Jig. Here are the chassis so far: the Cobra on the left and the Ferrari on the right. Before I trimmed the excess can material, I wrapped the motors of each car in green painter's tape to reduce the amount of cleaning that would be necessary after the trimming was complete. This also helps to keep debris out of the motors. I then proceeded to trim the excess can material on both chassis. I mocked up each chassis and did a test fit of the Cobra Daytona Coupe body and the Ferrari 250 GTO body to make sure that the hard points were correct. Our next steps will be detailing the bodies of each car and assembling the 2 running chassis to test. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe.